Hi, welcome back to the Network Plus certification video series. I'm Mike Redmond, Master Trainer, here to help guide you through your successful journey of becoming a Network Plus certified technician. We're going to walk through a wide variety of topics, starting with basic network concepts all the way through network management and security. In this segment, we're going to take a look at protecting your network. I'll discuss some of the common security threats in network computing, describe the methods for securing user accounts, and explain how firewalls, natting, port filtering, and packet filtering protect a network from threats. When it comes to protecting a network, you really need to know what you're protecting it from. Whether it be hackers or natural disasters, it all falls under what we consider a network threat. It's anything that can potentially damage the network data, the machines, or its users. We're going to examine some tools and methods to meet the requirements of today's networks. We're going to start by looking at some more common threats. We're going to look at everything from system crashes and malware all the way to social engineering and physical intrusion. Starting with system crashes or hardware failures, some of the most common types of failures are a hard drive crash or server lockups. Even a power failure would fall into this category. That's why with all modern networks, we try to build in what we identify as redundancy or fault tolerance. We do this, for instance, by providing battery backup or by implementing a RAID. When it comes to how we protect the data, well, we do this primarily by controlling access, whether it be by an access control list or individual administrative accounts. We are especially mindful of what we consider super accounts, like the Windows administrator or the root in Linux or Mac. Next, we have malware. Malware is any code designed to do something bad, basically, like viruses. A virus has two main jobs. First, to replicate, and then to activate. An important distinction with viruses is that it needs some sort of human interaction to spread. Unlike the worm, and a worm has an identical function to a virus. However, it replicates exclusively through networks and takes no human interaction. Generally, you'll find a worm is exploiting a flaw in some sort of program code. The next type of malware that we look at is macros. A macro, the dictionary term, is any virus exploiting application macros to replicate and activate. It exists in everyday applications like Microsoft Excel and Access. Next, you have Trojans. Trojans are sneaky. They disguise themselves as something useful to get the user to download them. And then, once executed, they unload their payload. Usually, this is how what's identified as a RAT, or a remote administrative tool, is installed on a user's PC. These RATs capture keystrokes and passwords and credit card information. They don't duplicate, per se, they just sit there. Next, we have rootkits. Like a Trojan, they are capable of hiding from all but the most aggressive anti-malware type tools. An example of this is Sony's anti-piracy scheme that they installed on music CDs. It installed on users' computers as a rootkit and created a backdoor that hackers later exploited. Next is adware. Adware monitors your frequently visited websites. It's what's used to generate targeted advertisements. They aren't in themselves overtly evil. However, they do have a tendency to suck up a lot of network resources. Next is spyware. Spyware sends information about your system or your actions over the internet. They may contain keystrokes, even sending all the contacts in your address book. Have you ever had someone that said that they received an email from you and you know you didn't send it? With so many types of malware, we have to figure out how to combat it. It all starts with a good anti-malware program. It should be running on your computer and also should be on your network appliances. You need to be sure to update these regularly so you're sure to have the most recent signatures. Next is training and awareness. You must train your users. They need to be trained to look and be able to recognize suspicious software. And of course, you need to train them never to run suspicious software. Most organizations have what's identified as an AEP. This is a set of policies and procedures that all users agree to before gaining access to the organization's network. The next way to begin combating malware is by good patch management practices. Keeping your systems and applications up to date keeps them less susceptible to modern malware attack. And of course, you need to have a plan, an incident response plan. It's a plan that has the procedures of what to do when malware is detected and how to react to malware infection. This should also be part of your ongoing training plan. Next, we'll talk about social engineering. Simply put, social engineering is the act of manipulating people to gain access to a network. There are many ways people use social engineering to gain unauthorized access to information, whether it be telephone scams or physical entry or phishing. That brings us to the man in the middle. That's when an attacker inserts him or herself into a conversation between two others. Usually we see man-in-the-middle attacks used to get passwords or access to sensitive data. The techniques used can go from very simplistic to very complicated. Usually you'll see this when employing a rogue wireless access point or simply social engineering. Next, we have the denial of service. This is an act that brings down a network or computing device. Essentially, a denial of service is performed by flooding the network with requests. An example of this would be the Smurf attack. The Smurf attack is a DOS attack that sends broadcast pings. The source IP is changed to another system's address, and then broadcast replies all return to the victim's IP address. This then begins to overwhelm the network with traffic, with all of these requests and no replies. The network just cannot handle it and comes to a halt. This, however, is different from a distributed denial of service attack. It's important to be able to distinguish between the two. A simple denial of service attack, you're only going to be dealing with one computer. A distributed denial of service attack, you're going to need to deal with multiple computers. Usually it's multiple computers under the control of a single operator. DDoS operators use malware to control computers called zombies. These zombies, when collectively put together, are what we call botnets. So at its root, the best way to prevent this is, again, with training. Remember, your computer cannot be controlled until someone installs the malware on it. Anti-malware software can only go so far. Training and proper procedures on how to prevent the computer from being infected in the first place can go a lot farther. Next, we'll look at physical intrusion. It is extremely important to protect your computing devices and especially your servers from physical intrusion. It should be a matter of practice to lock up your servers and your switches. Server rooms should have card key access. You should be keeping a log of all people that enter your server room. You should never walk away from the server without logging off, especially since most people that are dealing with servers are administrators and have logged in with administrative access. So now that we've protected the servers, It's just as important to protect the clients. Every client should be configured to use a screensaver, and that screensaver, when interrupted, should prompt the user for a password. Another form of physical intrusion to the client is one that's often overlooked. It's the data that is printed off from the client. When no longer needed, go in paper shredders. And again, user training is of utmost importance here. You should teach and train your users to never share their passwords and never write down their passwords and, for instance, shove them under their keyboards. As network administrators in modern networks, you're going to have to deal with wireless connections. There are some targeted attacks specific to wireless connections. They come in several different forms, whether it's leeching, wireless encryption cracking, road access points, or evil twins. Leeching, well, it is as it sounds. It's using another person's wireless network without that person's permission. This is usually accomplished by an activity called war driving and war chalking. Wireless encryption cracking is a bit more complicated. However, with the free tools freely available on the internet and the power of many consumer-grade laptops, it isn't as difficult as it once was. Again, this usually starts with the activities of war driving and war chalking. While encryption can prevent leeching, you need to be sure to choose the right encryption. All modern wireless routers will come with 3 types of encryption: WEP, WPA, and WPA2. With WEP and WPA, cracking is relatively simple. By running a simple sniffer program to capture enough packets, that program will sniff out the password because both WEP and WPA use a pre-shared key. Next, we'll talk about rogue access points. A rogue access point is simply an unauthorized WAP. They are a huge problem in today's networks. They're extremely cheap, and unfortunately, it's extremely easy to plug into some networks. Employees have a tendency to install them for convenience at their desk. They're rarely ever installed by the bad guy themselves. However, the bad guys then detect the unsecured WAP plugged into your network and then gain access through that unsecure WAP. Now, this is not to be confused with the evil twin. It is very similar to a rogue access point. However, this is set up by the bad guys. An evil twin is used to fool people into logging into a rogue access point. It looks legitimate. It probably will even have an SSID configured as your network. This is designed to cause confusion. The hope is to get your users to authenticate to the evil twin, and it will then steal the passwords associated with your network. Now, the bad guy can simply log into your wireless network with authorized credentials. You might often hear this referred to, and the Network Plus examination also calls this a wireless phishing attack. Now, let's look at how to secure your user accounts. When talking about securing user accounts, the best place to start is with the internal threat. This can be best categorized as unauthorized access, data destruction, either intentionally or accidental, and other types of administrative problems. You also need to consider authentication. Authenticating users provides the first step in securing user accounts. Simply put, authentication means that a person can prove his or her identity. The typical authentication sequence is identification, authentication, and then authorization. It's easier to remember it as ID, authn, and author. When dealing with authentication, there are multiple factors. These factors are what users use to authenticate themselves to the system. It's either something a user has, something a user knows, or something a user is. We break these out and identify them as the ownership factor, the knowledge factor, or the inherit factor. The strongest type of authentication has widely been accepted as multi-factor authentication. This is simply combining two or more of the three factors. Passwords are what most people will think of when dealing with authentication. It is the ultimate key to protecting the network and the most widely used of the factors. Best practice indicates that you should protect your password at all times. Make users change passwords at regular intervals and never write your passwords down. Some common alternatives to passwords would be things like smart devices or biometric devices. These fall in the other two-factor categories. Smart devices, or something that someone has, would be like cards with magnetic stripes or USB key fobs. Biometric devices would be something that a user is, like a fingerprint scanner or a retina scanner. However, protecting user accounts isn't all on the user. The administrators have to do their part, remembering that controlling user accounts is important because these user accounts contain the usernames and passwords. Access to these accounts should be tightly restricted, and you should always apply what's identified as least privilege. This means that no one person has any more or any less permission required to do their job. And as part of good housekeeping, you should always disable unused user accounts. When it comes to administration, it is easiest to control user account permission by group policy. That's to say that you assign the appropriate permissions to a group, and then you add the user accounts to that group. Also, you should be careful with the default groups that come with a lot of operating systems, like the Everyone group and the guest accounts. The guest account, for instance, should always just be disabled. You should take the utmost diligence in managing your users' accounts. In today's widely growing IT base, administrators are often, for instance, part of human resources. They can create and disable and enable or even delete user accounts based on an employee's status. This has become necessary because we need to keep up with employee changes. And what better location to keep up with changes in employment status than human resources? Another issue that we have to deal with when dealing with user accounts is the issue of inheritance. Inheritance can be explained like this. You have one set of permissions for a user explicitly assigned to a folder, and then a second set of explicit permissions to a subfolder. Well, inheritance determines the user's actual permissions to that subfolder's contents. Next, we'll discuss firewalls. Firewalls protect a private network from external threats. They use a variety of methods to do this, and they're not necessarily always a dedicated device. What's most important is the placement of your firewall. For instance, a network-based firewall should be at least at the edge of a network. You have your choice of either a hardware or software-based firewall to perform this function. Also, it's important to have a host-based firewall. This will be located at the endpoints or your users' computers. Some of the more common firewall technologies would begin with hiding IPs. We do this with network address translation or NATing. You should also consider packet filtering and port filtering. This restricts packets based on port numbers or blocks packets based on a specific IP address. One way to identify all open connections on a machine is with the netstat command. You can open up the command line and type in netstat -n, and this shows all the open HTTP connections, for instance, on this machine. Many of today's home routers are even capable of web-based port filtering by interface. Here's a look at a common Linksys router, fairly simple to set up and administer. Here's a look at the YAS configuration program in a Linux machine. The next type of firewall technology would be stateless or stateful filtering. Stateless filtering only checks for IP addresses and port numbers. That has given way to stateful packet inspection. This examines packets as a stream and detects when streams are interrupted or packets are corrupt. You'll often find this technology employed with Layer 7 application proxies. However, bear in mind that stateful packet inspection firewalls are a bit more expensive, and they do have a tendency to slow down traffic on your network. Next would be MAC filtering. It's similar to packet filtering, except it filters based on the MAC address of a client. However, this can be defeated by a technique called MAC spoofing. This is done by an attacker changing his MAC address to a known good MAC address and bypassing your firewall. Next, you have personal firewalls. CompTIA calls these host-based firewalls. If you're using a dial-up connection, they're not really necessary. However, for internet connections, they are. These are often used in addition to hardware-based firewalls, programs like Windows Firewall and Zone Alarm Pro. The Windows Firewall is included with all modern editions of the Windows operating system, and by default, it blocks all incoming IP packets that attempt to initiate a session. And then, if needed, you will manually open up the ports required for your organization. This is okay for a single machine or possibly a small network. However, a more robust solution would be recommended for larger organizations. The next way that we protect our networks is with network zones. Each zone should be assigned a level of access to the network. You'll find a firewall that sits between the gateway router and your private network. That space between the two is called the DMZ, or demilitarized zone. This is a lightly protected network that sits between your private network and the internet. Here's a look at a typical DMZ configuration. The next thing to consider when securing our networks is securing remote access. For employees to access the network from home, this is a necessary requirement, and with a more and more mobile workforce, there's really no way around it. It's extremely cost-effective for both workers and employers. However, it does present a unique security challenge. We have to find a way to balance the security with the employees' request for ease of access. Next is vulnerability scanners. Programs like Nmap and Nessus are utilities. They're little programs that can scan a network to determine things like open ports or passive applications. Nmap is an open source port scanner, and Nessus is a popular open source vulnerability scanner. However, it does have some commercial variation.
Well, there you have it. Pretty simple, right? I know, it can be a lot of information coming at you all at once, but don't worry, I'm here to guide you every step of the way. You can do this. Just remember, study hard, lots of practice questions, and you will succeed. You will become a Network Plus certified technician. I'll see you next time.